Hi, we're live. Welcome everyone after a bit of a break to the RecHangout Show. I'm speaking from the control tower as always in beautiful Norfolk, England. My name is Louis. Welcome from Colleagues Software. We're having a candidate experience discussion today, talking about how it affects and is critical to your company brand and how can it be improved. And we're talking to some of the leading people in this area who can really share with us some of their experiences at their own businesses and experiences of those who have been in the Candy Awards and leading the way in this field. As always, this RecHangout is supported by Smart Recruit Online, and we have Mark Stevens here. We've got Louise Trent, who will be keeping an eye on Twitter, #RecHangout from UK Recruiter, and Alan Whitford, who will be leading the way from Abtech Partnership with the questions and the discussions and keeping the conversations flowing. I'd like to welcome our guests, and I'll just flip to my notes. We've got Gerry Crispin back again. Gerry, welcome back. I think it's been a couple of years. Co-founder of CareerXroads and the Candies Candidate Experience Awards. So it'd be good to hear all about them and how things are going, Gerry. And we've got Chris Hoyt here as well, former talent manager and marketing leader at Pepsico and a partner at CareerXroads. Welcome, Chris. We've got Lee Evans as well here. Thank you for coming on, Lee. Talent Acquisition Manager at KV Snacks. And Charu Malhotra as well, who has tons of experience in 10 years of digital marketing, social media strategy and employer branding. Has worked at places like Unilever, Primark and Ferrero. Ferrero, if I can pronounce that correctly. Welcome on the show. If you want to join in, on your right-hand side, you should have the Webinar Jam feed. Johnny's here already. Please comment and post your questions on there. And we also have the Twitter hashtag, of course, so we'll be keeping an eye on that. I think that's all from me. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Louis, and welcome everybody to the show. This should be a dynamic show. And we're not just going to run over the usual, boy, why does candidate experience really stink? Because we've had that conversation a lot. What we really want to do is take the more positive side. It is, what are organizations doing to really make the candidate experience great, but also how are organizations, particularly HR and recruitment, liaising with the Marcoms part of their business and say, hey, this has an impact on our overall company brand and maybe even straight to the bottom line. So if you've got some questions about that, if any of you out there in the audience are actually struggling with that or have run up against that now, ping your message into the Webinar Jam or onto the hashtag RecHangout, and we'll incorporate your questions. As Louis said, we got some great experience in all of this area, and we're going to actually invite our guests to just give a couple minutes on what they're all about and maybe what they think their primary thought for the day will be as we go through this conversation. And Lee, because you're the real newbie to our group and your screen's up first on mine, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and welcome to the RecHangout.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. So I guess my background is primarily in consumer-facing organisations, so retail, automotive, leisure and hospitality, and now in FMCG. So I've been very much at the coalface, as it were, dealing with candidates as an in-house recruiter, filling vacancies day to day. So candidate experience is critical to us filling roles and to our business performance going forward. So I'm looking forward to a really good conversation today, trying to learn from some of the guys on the call.
Okay, excellent. So I think we're going to get a lot of input from you today. As you said, you've worked for some big brands like VW, which obviously has some brand issues at the moment. Wonder how that might be impacting on recruitment. It might be going the opposite way. What happens when your corporate brand is in the crapper? What does that do for your recruitment? Gerry, welcome on board. You also run and part of the Candidate Experience Awards, where obviously these questions come up a lot. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, and it's CareerXroads, Louis, even though it's spelled X-Roads, and tell us a bit about what you think we should be talking about today.
Yeah, well, CareerXroads is in its 20th year, and we obviously help folks who are talent acquisition leaders talk to each other, so we can hear a lot of them talking about the complaints and the issues around candidate experience. But my real passion around this is that within the last 5 or 6 years, we've been able to build a nonprofit organization that actually studies the candidate experience to get us to a point where we're making decisions based on data rather than opinion. And in the past year, with over nearly 250,000 completed surveys by candidates of more than 250 companies across the world, from EMEA to the United States to Asia-Pac, we have some heavy data that is still being studied by not only corporations but universities, and we're coming back with some of the critical factors that actually are affecting the rating that candidates will give you. So we have a lot more confidence now on what candidate experience is and what actually impacts the rating and how that impacts your bottom line.
That's super, Gerry. That's really excellent. And Chris, you were been involved in that, and obviously with Pepsico, you did a huge amount of work on analyzing what the candidate experience was doing, and also what your recruiters were doing. Do you feel that this type of data is actually informing companies making changes to how they actually do things?
Yeah, thanks. I do. I think that a lot of companies are actually starting to really take in the last couple of years, and largely I think in part to the spotlight that the candies tie to this, the Candidate Experience Awards sort of shine on this. But I think they're starting to take that experience seriously, and I think there's definitely a connection from the consumer side, as you mentioned, so buying power, as we talk about how many of our candidates are actually customers or we should be treating like customers. And I think that gets some real attention and some traction in the last couple of years, largely in part because of data that they're collecting as a result of the candies, or even some organizations that are sort of launching their own micro-surveys or their own initiatives to sort of search that out.
Okay, and Chris, by the way, just for our audience who might not know who you are you?
Well, until about 9 months ago, for 5 years prior, I led the talent engagement and marketing strategies for the global TA teams at PepsiCo. I've been in talent acquisition for over 20 years now, and since September of last year, actually, we call me the Mark 2.0. So Mark Mailer was Gerry Crispin's former partner at CareerXroads, and I bought his share of the business to come on board and continue to learn from the likes of Gerry, and just really actually get paid to have some really great conversations all day long with talent acquisition professionals around the world.
It sounds like the ideal job, Chris, and you know, no more booted and suited. What could be wrong with that?
I'm not sure I was ever suited, but that's fine.
And Charu, our final guest of the day, you obviously have come out of some quite large organizations like Unilever, where a brand was important. In fact, when we first met, at our SR Conf, you were early doors into thinking about how employment brand was going to have an effect on the business and vice versa. How does that play into what you're doing these days?
Sure. So I think that was 6 or 7 years ago, and that whole merging of the candidate and the consumer was still a dialogue that we were having, and felt like no one was listening. I think what's really happened with not just things like the candies, but things like Glassdoor and a much wider sense of transparency where people can't hide, is organizations recognizing that recruitment does not belong only to recruiters or talent acquisition. So in terms of what I'm doing now, or I spent the last 18 months working in retail, I think the realization that it does have an impact on the bottom line is dawning on the enlightened marketing directors and the enlightened CEOs. Where I'd like to see this conversation going really is in 12 months' time, this not being an HR transformation, this being a CEO transformation or a CEO aspiration.
Well, I think that's a great place for you and the guys to kick off, and I'll probably just shut up for the next half hour and let the four of you talk about that. I mean, Gerry, are you seeing with the work that you're doing that it is getting into the C-suite, the CEO, and is being more interested in this than it's getting out of HR?
I think there's a lot of stress on the part of CEOs to avoid this issue, because it obviously has been avoided for many, many years. But more and more companies are, in fact, demonstrating the cost as well as the reward of doing it well. And you wanted to focus in on doing it well, so let me give you one story from Hilton. About 2 years ago, they got heavily involved in doing a white glove kind of candidate experience, focusing in on some of the key issues that are important to engage the candidate in terms of setting expectations, giving feedback, and a variety of things. So they spent a significant amount of money to do it with a small group of their candidates, in this case veterans. And then they gave them a gold card and tracked how much money they spent with Hilton in the year that following not getting hired at Hilton. They were also able to see how much they spent in the year preceding not getting hired at Hilton. And the aggregate difference, the delta, was $113 million. So the head of talent acquisition was able to go to the CHRO and talk a little bit more about what value the budget would have in talent acquisition if they changed the candidate experience for all of those candidates.
Okay,
that gets to the C-suite.
Yeah, I would say 113 million. That works for me. Maybe we could actually get a recruiting budget then. Lee, could you spend that 113 million?
Absolutely, yeah, in a heartbeat. That's really interesting to see. I mean, we are obviously nowhere near that kind of size of a business, but we've been talking about candidate experience and whether we could equate any figures to it in all the businesses that I've worked in for the last half a dozen, 7, 8 years or so, and it's really difficult to do. It's really difficult to lay hands on that kind of data. I'm not sure how Charu has found it over recent years, but it's really difficult for us. It's really hard. We kind of work on the basis that we act very quickly to any feedback, direct feedback that we get. I've spotted an email in the last few weeks from a candidate maybe has been waiting a little bit longer for feedback on a process than they wanted. But this kind of data is a completely different league. So.
Well, it is, Lee, but one of the things that you could do, and I think almost anyone can do, is figure out how to engage each and every candidate who's applied with at least a single question.
Yeah.
And if you have one question to ask, I would certainly be focused in on the Net Promoter Score approach. We do it a little bit differently, but we are in fact asking the question that a lot of the marketing folks ask customers, which is, based on your experience with us, how far you went in the candidate, pool here, would you refer others to apply? And the answer to that can be used to calculate a Net Promoter Score by subtracting the most ugly answer from the percent who answer it very, very well. And we're now showing a range that goes from, over the last several years, from about -20, because you could go from -100, but -20 to 60. And by studying some of the companies that are in the high numbers, you can benchmark some of the practices that they are doing that have the highest impact on the ratings as well as the behavior downstream in terms of not referring people or going out of their way. If you had a bad experience, what we've discovered is that on average, about 25 to 30% of all those who have a bad will go out of their way to dissuade other people from applying to your company, which really changes the friction, really, of recruiting.
Well, and Gerry, what's interesting about those numbers you have there is I go back to 10 years or so ago, we did some research with Total Jobs, and we asked candidates, if you've had a bad experience, would you buy that company's products or services? And even then, 70% of the people, and across the socioeconomic geographic divide, 70% said no. Now, what we didn't have in those days was the ability to do the follow-up research would be, well, how long would that be a no? Is that just tomorrow or next week? But it's obviously a significant impact. If you don't have a good experience, it does impact what else you do.
Yeah, I think the thing there is, you're really talking about intention. So we don't know how many actually convert their intention to not buying the product or to some other kind of behavior. However, we know it's there, and I think that's the next stage that we would like to get to, because we are also showing about 30 to 40% will change their relationship with the company that gave them a bad experience.
Charu, have you looked at that as well? And I'm thinking not only currently, but also back to the Unilever days, measuring that candidate experience using what Gerry talked about around the Net Promoter Score type approach?
We didn't, but I'm a big fan of the Net Promoter Score methodology. I mean, for me, whereas before, 5-6 years ago, I tried to learn most from branding and marketing. If I was to spend more time with the customer experience directors or the guys that actually analyze the customer journey, I think as recruiters or people in the space that we work in, that will be best rewarded. Because I think sometimes we talk about candidate experience in a big, almost it becomes too much like noise and hubris, but we don't isolate and map out at a granular level the different elements that the candidate and the applicant and the employee touch us. So to answer your question, no, I haven't. Big fan of the NPS, but I think, what does good candidate experience enhancement look like? It's actually understanding what is our process and how many times do we touch the candidate, and how many people actually touch it. Because sometimes, and I'm sure Chris will agree from PepsiCo days and Lee, it can be as transactional as when they come into the reception, are they greeted well? I've been a candidate and I've had somebody actually say to me, and I won't name who it is, but it's a big consumer brand. This happened 5-6 years ago when I signed in. Wow, that's a funny name. Now, I felt quite insulted. Most people would. So I said it's mapping out the candidate journey from end to end and how many people are touching it, and that's when I think we can start enhancing. Because otherwise, it's a very generic term, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would say that you hit the nail on the head, and I think that there are a lot of organizations, talent acquisition teams, that are really struggling to partner with internal marketing and from the consumer side, the marketing teams. And I think the data like this, the data that comes out of this research, and putting some real numbers to each of these candidates and the impact they have on the business, is a huge and relatively easy way to sort of legitimize a lot of the work they're doing around that and help to foster that partnership. And I think that's a big, if you don't have that relationship internally, that's a really big thing to struggle and try to make happen. But when it does happen, there's a little bit of magic there, because those teams typically have a little more experience and expertise on the marketing side, and usually, especially as big consumer brands, some more resources that the HR, the talent acquisition teams don't have at their disposal right away.
And Chris, tying into that, and we've got a question from one of our viewers and listeners, Rahul. He wants to know what are the top 3 things then we should aim for around this NPS from a candidate perspective. He wonders, isn't it all just really come back down? Isn't it just about communication?
I think communication is a piece of it, but I think we're also talking about a complete experience across the board. It's the ease of getting in and finding what you're looking for. It's the ease of being able to quickly apply and get out of that process. It's follow-up, whether it's as simple as something, I think, being automated, or just, quite honestly, just being treated like a human being when you're going through that application process.
So that kind of ties in with what Rahul's also said, is that, sorry, Charu, is that it's about expectation. So his experience, disappointment comes from expectation. So Charu, you had an expectation that someone wouldn't make fun of your name, when you signed in. And so you're disappointed because they did. I mean, I don't know, that's a very personal thing to have done. I mean, geez, they talked to me about being bald. What can I do about it, But if we set the expectation in one sense for the candidate and we don't live up to that, that certainly leads to disappointment, doesn't it?
It does. I want to add on to Chris's points that often, before we actually think about the candidate, we don't spend enough time working with our business about what we're actually looking for. So a lot of this is down to misalignment. So, when I'm training recruiters and when I'm working with recruitment teams, the intake session is a critical part of that, because often the candidate experience can be jarred and disenfranchised because we're looking for a sort of a piranha, and we're sort of looking in a goldfish bowl. So that's really kind of just an example of, before the candidate experience even starts, we start by identifying what are we actually looking for, so that we don't misalign our expectations and the candidate's expectations. So I think Chris's point was, it's an experience, is absolutely spot on. It's an end-to-end experience, starting from what are we looking for as a business, to the company, the person actually coming in and having a great onboarding process.
Lee, you look like you're ready to pop in there.
No, well, no, I'm just thinking. You just generated a few thoughts in my mind around whether we should be dictating what that experience is, or whether we should be going to the candidates, speaking to candidates first to find out what they want, or should we be saying, this is what we want you to see, this is our shop window, so here's our fantastic careers microsite, and here's some information about the recruitment process and what you can expect, or whether that needs to be tailored to, well, thinking about our organisation, we have a number of different locations in the UK, so does that need to be location specific? We're not global, we're just in the UK, but we know we have certain attributes in certain parts of the country. We know, for example, some of our northeastern factories have a great reputation as being a local employer and a great place to work. Is that the same for our corporate office, which has just relocated in the last 6 months? Do we need to tailor that message specifically by location and by group to candidates? I'm not sure. At the moment, we've got one message. It's a one message fits all type of approach for us, but going forward, I guess that's something that I've just started to think about.
Well, and I agree with you, and I think, Charu, you nail it. There are expectations that get set before the recruiting process actually even begins externally that have an impact downstream to how that candidate is actually treated and how they end up perceiving us. Their experience is not just the website, their experience is not just the search, their experience is not just the recruiter. It goes all the way through to how they're treated through the interview. It goes all the way through to the follow-up and the impression that they get. And I think and Gerry can probably talk about this, a big piece of what was interesting to me when I was first taking part in the Candies was the response back from a lot of the candidates who said, I didn't feel like I got a chance to showcase my skills. I felt like I came in, I was asked a bunch of questions, and I was sort of hurried off the line. And I think that's just a really big miss, that we are often a little bit, as recruiters, a little bit overworked, and we're a little bit, under the gun to fill some numbers, and sometimes it can be easy to forget that.
Yeah, Lee, I think one of the things that I hear from you is the difficulty in accessing the data that would help you change, whether it be by facility or geography or by whatever, to better align your brand in that area, to the candidates that you really want. And where you get into that circle is a key issue. Some companies like Deloitte spend huge amounts of money researching the very specific types of candidates that they want all over the world in different places, so that they can build a persona not only by job but by location, and match that to the brand itself. But you can get into it if you add other questions. So I'll give you an example. Capital One, in their card division, on average asks 16 questions of every candidate who applies during the course of a month, and that's about 10,000. They get 50% response rates, which is a whole different set of issues here. But they actually take that data and they cut it by facility, by job level, by everything, including by recruiter. They stack rank every single recruiter every month and publish the results in terms of their candidate experience. And then they challenge the best 5 recruiters to hold a webinar for all the other recruiters on how we can improve the candidate experience. Their numbers are extraordinary, and the data that they're collecting helps them to change not only how they manage the application process. So, for example, the last question they now use in every application is, what didn't we ask you that you think is important to tell us about your skills, knowledge, and experience, specifically focusing in on the perception of fairness, that the things that cause me to want to apply to your company may not be the kinds of things in your head that you wanted to evaluate. And opening that up influences the perception of fairness, which has the single largest correlation to how you are rated. And it's not as obvious, but as you ask candidates what makes it unfair, they start giving you feedback, and this is the kind of feedback that they now change their application process, then their interview process, all the way to onboarding, as Chris pointed out. It is not just the candidates who get so far, it is really the entire process from how they research you all the way through onboarding that we're defining this piece. And getting granular about that is difficult, but if you have some evidence that there's one thing that's really sticking out, then you can focus in on that.
I think what's interesting to me, and maybe this goes a little off the rails, is that I feel like we have a lot of conversations around, what can we do from an experience standpoint, what can we do from a brand standpoint to attract more candidates, to us as an employer. What we don't hear a lot of people talking about is what can we do that will help people to opt out or select out, or how can we repel candidates by being a little more transparent and putting some things up that are actually a real look at the organization from a warts and all perspective. And I think, unfortunately, right now the large majority of organizations, people only see the warts on the likes of an Indeed forum or on a Glassdoor, or some of those tough decisions or tough discussions don't happen in the employment branding piece. Like, will you work over 40 hours a week? You bet your ass there's some days you might work more than 40 hours a week. Are you going to miss maybe this or that? Yeah, you might, but here are some of the perks that sort of go with that. That's hard from a branding side to sort of be able to buckle up and have those conversations, or present that out to the public, because it's kind of scary.
Well, and I think, Chris, you're right. And funny enough, Johnny in our webinar jam chat, which is rocking and rolling with a bunch of people, and he's also making a similar point about, basically, trying to get your process and your traction to only be for those people you really want to apply. I've always said recruitment is by definition a restrictive practice, or it should be making it that. But also that comes back to, are we advertising we want some skills as opposed to what's the work? And you're right. If I know that the work is I'm going to be sitting on a machine and I'm going to be filling bags of crisps all day long, that may not be the most riveting job I've ever had, but at least I know that's what the job is, and I'll only apply to it if I realize that's what I've got to do. And I think we do run some challenges with that as organizations about, we don't really want to talk about how crappy some of our jobs are, because that's not what we thought we wanted to do. I'm going to do a quick reset and then we can carry on, but this is the Rec Hangout. We're talking about the candidate experience, the impact on the company and its brand, and even to its bottom line. And we've got a great panel with Lee Evans, Gerry Crispin, Chris Hoyt, and Charu Malhotra, as long as our usual stalwarts of Mark Stevens, Louis Welcome, and Louise Triance, and I'm Alan Whitford. It's been pretty robust so far. Gerry's brought a lot of stuff in about what the Candidate Experience Awards are getting real data and real research for companies. But one thing, Gerry, Chris, that I would ask is, certainly when you guys, and Gerry, when you started this, the big challenge, and we certainly saw it here in EMEA, is that companies are just afraid to ask the question. They may not really want to know.
Yes.
How do you get them to sign up?
If I knew that, Alan, it would we'd already be a monster organization. We're now up. I think this year we're going to probably have 250 companies involved in the United States. It looks like we're on track to get about 75 companies in EMEA. Well, no, that's not true. About 150 companies. Fewer, though, of those will want to go the whole way and ask questions of their candidates. So we're getting there, but right now it's a slower growth rather than doubling. And yes, it is because corporations still are risk averse. Duh. I mean, it just is what it is. And once they start thinking about going beyond documenting their own practices to asking the candidates to look in the mirror and give them this kind of sense of how they're doing against that, it's difficult. However, I will tell you that when a company has the gut check to do it, they suddenly discover that they have the data to make changes that have a higher impact than if they just wandered around randomly picking at things to do. Because now we have the ability to connect how different companies execute on how well they listen, or how well they set expectations, or how well they close the door, both at the beginning as well as the end, as well as how they change the perception of this being a fair process and one that is not cooked. So different companies execute totally differently, and that is really where the connection to their brand comes. Some companies are kind of tough. They're hard-ass companies where they have very, very difficult jobs, and they are going to approach sharing information well as giving feedback clearly in a different way than companies that are already the best place in the world to work for. It's a lot easier if you've got a perception that working there is extraordinary. People are lined up, and you do want to move more of them out in terms of their ability to come. So what we're finding is that there's a slow change at this particular juncture. Companies have to get over their PR and their lawyers' reluctance, if you will, to collecting data. And we've done that as best we can by sharing the data openly. Obviously, it's not a cost issue because so far for 6 years we've done this for free. And hopefully we can continue to do that for the next few years, as long as we have the support of some extraordinary vendors and suppliers who are sponsoring what we're doing.
Thanks, Gerry, and thanks for that background and that explanation. It kind of leads me to one of the thoughts, and if I go back to our original theme, which is what is the impact on the company and the company brand, not just the employer brand. And that, to me, when I do an employment brand project, I think, Chris, you mentioned this earlier as well, it's not just about the attraction, which is what most people seem to think it's about. It's what happens during onboarding, what happens once they're already working there. Did the meat match the sizzle that you promised me as a great recruiter, and that I got here and I didn't have a desk and they didn't know my name, and and I didn't need a laptop or anything. In fact, I didn't even know I was supposed to be at work. And that impacts on that brand as well, doesn't it?
Yes, sorry, I had to find the unmute button. Yeah, I think it goes all the way through. I do think it's past. It's everything from my first exposure to the brand. So I think it goes all the way out front, all the way through to pre-boarding and onboarding, and quite some time after the hire. So I think it's really important. I think expectations are a big deal on both ends, both sides of the equation. And I really just think a lot of things come down to how that brand is communicated and how we're actually communicating to those candidates. I mean, this is not rocket science, but it is something that is a struggle for many organizations to get their arms around.
I was going to say exactly the same thing, that this isn't a difficult set of processes that need to be put in place. But I mean, we deal with probably 200 companies who use our online system, and very few of them actually could even tell you what their processes are at each stage in the application process. Never mind whether other people in the organisation that are going to engage with candidates have any idea on what the process is that HR is trying to execute within the organisation. So I mean, some of you must have gone into an organisation and realised that that was the status quo when you got there. Where do you start if you're a small organisation in terms of putting together a process from start to finish? I guess it starts right at the very beginning with writing that job description through to the onboarding process, and and how can it be managed, and how can you get other people to buy into that?
Go ahead.
Open question. So, well, I guess I'm kind of in that position here with in my current role. So, our business went through a change of ownership, three and a half years ago, and we've been going through untold change since then. So, internal structures as well as our kind of recruitment processes. So, my team was an RPO solution. Obviously, this team's now brought in-house, so we're actually in the middle of this as we speak. So at the moment, we're focusing on kind of talking with our hiring managers about the impact of the process and being very, very clear as to who owns what as part of the not only the kind of the resourcing, the screening, the assessment and selection, but also the candidate management piece as well. So that goes right up to as you say, Mark, onboarding and induction. So we're going through a process of pulling together a hiring manager's toolkit, some do's and don'ts, some kind of cheat sheets that we can share with our internal managers during the course of the process, and just talk to them about it. So I think there's historically a bit of a feeling. It's not just, I'm not talking about this business now, but there's still a little bit of a feeling, I think, in the UK, because that's where all of my experience comes from, that the HR or the recruitment team will do this for you. It's not just HR's responsibility. It's not just the recruiter's responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility to own that experience and be part of it, be there and be open and honest about what's going on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that there's a big piece of that. I mean, when you start, I think you begin, especially in a large organization, you start where you know that you can make a difference, and you start where you can actually have an impact. And it's easy to say just changing job descriptions will have a big difference, but in some organizations, changing job descriptions is a massive undertaking, because you're talking about thousands of job codes, you're talking about things that tie to comp and departments that have to come into it, and it can get a little bit crazy. I think documentation, I think you're spot on. Documentation is a big deal. Quick reference guides, training. So it is about education, but I also think it's about identifying influencers and business partners throughout the organization that help you to move that needle, because it's, I said it's not rocket science, but it's tough sometimes to get your arms around what needs to change and the order in which a lot of that needs to be executed.
I also think it's a compelling business necessity. So as long as there's one person who believes that, now the issue is, how does that person arm themselves with the kind of data in which they can persuade business leaders within their organization to take that first step. We've obviously been building a series of white papers that delineate some of that, talk about some of those experiences, and they're large companies, of course, but there's also a lot of small companies who are participating in that, and some of them have extraordinary responses to the candidates that they engage, and that impacts their ability to move forward. So as long as there's one person who can be champion, the data is starting to be available now, and you have access to your peers in the same industry more easily than ever before, to be able to ask them what kinds of data they personally are developing that are helping them move forward. And now you bring that to your business leaders, and you're really forcing the discussion further.
All right, thanks, Gerry, guys. And I think we're getting some interesting comments again in our webinar jam from the agency perspective, where they actually stay in contact with the candidate throughout, the first 3 months anyway, because they don't get paid otherwise. But they're also asking those candidates, what's it been like? Was the job what we said it was going to be? If not, we need to amend our job descriptions and our candidate attraction piece. But I feel that probably doesn't happen that often internally. And you're right, Chris, it's a huge job to change job descriptions. Not everybody can jump on Lou Adler's boat, and say, okay, it's all about, it's a lot of work to do. But don't we need to at least make a start?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not saying it's too big to tackle. I think Gerry calls out something really big too, is that really worth looking at is you've got to make sure in order to be successful, especially the larger the organization, is that you've got some champions that are willing to support you and stand behind that initiative and push. And then I think it's also the onus on who's passionate about this and the role that you're in, finding other influencers and champions internally to try to take this on. So I don't think it's too big to tackle. I just think that, and it varies by organization, it's been my experience that you've got to pick the things where you know you can move the needle and build on that and build those partnerships internally, continue that momentum.
I mean, I would add to that.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
My first in-house role was at BP about 11 years ago, and the way that we looked at candidate experience was around resourcing transformation. So, candidate experience, we hear it all the time, and it can sort of sound quite fluffy. So we looked at it from a resourcing transformation perspective, and you're quite right, it was about getting the right sponsors, but viewing it like change management. And when a business goes through change management, they put discipline behind it, they put KPIs behind it, they put resource behind it, document things, they look at iterative changes, they don't go job done, here we are, finished. Everything gets improved on a continuous improvement perspective. And that's how I think we look at it. And for me, there's sort of one takeaway is that the candidate experience, or I believe it's linked to recruitment capability, is not possible until a business recognizes that the hiring manager, the line manager, has an equal responsibility. I don't think it can be done in isolation. And I really, when I've done this successfully, it's been really engaging, like Lee was saying, with the line managers, onboarding, recruiting, job descriptions. These aren't just recruiter responsibilities. They sit with the business. But I think it's change management we're talking about, and in HR we're not very good at it. And I think we can learn from functions that do it really well.
What about with smaller businesses? Because smaller businesses haven't got access to the data. I mean, shouldn't they just start with some of the basics? There's a list of things that you can do without actually having research. Responding to a candidate as they apply, outlining in that response what's going to happen during the application process, provide them with some additional information about the organisation, a link to a video, it's how they're going to get back to them. These are just basic things that even smaller organisations can do, and you don't really need data to know that these should be standard touch points and processes that we can all apply to improve the candidate experience.
You mean it should be common sense what one should do, Lewis?
Mark.
Yeah, well, the problem with that. So the point is, how much does setting expectations actually impact the candidate experience? And the answer is yes, it does, and it is common sense, but not a lot of people have common sense relative to it. And what are the different ways in which people can set those expectations? Is it about the job? In some cases, it is much more important to set expectations about what the job is about, because of a variety of different factors within the environment and the employer brand. In other cases, I have to tell you, it is much more important to set expectations about what the recruiting process is about. And that has the most important impact, if you will, on acquiring great candidates, is being able to share how this will flow forward over the next few days or few weeks. And so fundamentally, knowing the difference between that, I think, is important. But I do think that a small company, to answer your specific question, can do a lot of little bit of A/B testing. And if they take some of the case studies from Chaudhry, from PepsiCo, from some of the other companies where that is more explicit, they can begin by examining different pieces of the process, trying one thing, and then measuring to see whether or not it has had an impact on the candidates for that particular job. Then I think small companies are able to deal with data. But I will also argue that even the smallest company has access to data now, because that data is free. It's out there, and we're not the only ones sharing that data. But the reality is, it's there in large quantities to be able to examine. It may not be specific to you, but you can see where it's specific to a lot of other companies.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to discourage people looking for data and having the resources to be able to develop their own.
Yeah, it's hard when you're small.
And thanks, Gerry, for that, and Mark for bringing that question up. Just do a final reset. We got about 15 minutes to go. This is Rec Hangout. I'm Alan Whitford with our guests talking about candidate experience, impact and company brand, impact and the bottom line. We've got Charu Malhotra, Chris Hoyt, Gerry Crispin, and Lee Evans, as well as our usual Rec Hangout team. Guys, I think one thing I'd like to try and maybe get us around to in that last 15 minutes, and we've had a we got about 20 or 25 people in the webinar jam throwing questions and comments at each other, which has been great as well. So you've really sparked people's thinking. Let's come back to that, if we don't mind. How do we get those champions? And Charu, you're quite right. We need the hiring line managers to be actively involved. But it feels to me that we still really, really need to have corporate comms, corporate branding, employment branding actively involved. And I just know personal experience. I was at a meeting yesterday where I've got an employment brand person and a corporate brand person totally aligned. I'm like really excited. And then the HRD says, oh, but everything you're describing just seems like too much stuff. I just need some templates and a tagline. So not quite sure how we get those champions all aligned. Experience that you've had, Charu?
Yes, painfully. And in some ways, actually, working for I've done one role that's been at a more a FTSE 350, and it was slightly easier, I have to say, than working at the BPs and the Unilevers of this world. But yeah, I've experienced that. But I think, you know, to sort of Mark's point earlier, starting with some of the basics is helpful. But you know, the adage is, you know, ultimately every company wants to grow, whether it's via acquisition or via, you know, new products, or, you know, just, you know, growth is obviously every CEO's objective, and you can only grow with great people not leaving and great people joining. So I think, you know, we can overcomplicate this, and it's, you know, it's horses for courses. You know, it's having that communication conversation with the stakeholder at the top, the MD in this case, that was, if you want to grow, Mr. CEO, we need to fix this. And often it's unearthing something they never knew was existing. They had no idea that we had, you know, 20,000 people in an ATS. Someone mentioned earlier, you know, asking candidates. I think it was Lee. It was a really good point. You know, let's not presume we know what candidates want to see. And, you know, before we start investing in CRMs and paying for research, it's great that there's data available freely, but, you know, we can often, I'm guilty of it, spend an awful lot of money on new innovation, new papers, yada, yada, yada. And we're all sitting on great ATSs, well, not great, okay ATSs in some cases, full of people that are saying we want to work for you, and we don't even bother asking them questions about their experience, about their thoughts, about their what they think about the brand. So that was a really long-winded answer. I apologise. So yes, I've experienced what you described. B, it's been painful, but I think it's, you know, communicating in a way that's relevant to that stakeholder. But actually, let's not presume we know what good candidate experience looks like. An applicant and a candidate and someone at the third interview is looking for a very different look, feel, touch experience from me, and I shouldn't ever be so arrogant to know what that is. Let's start talking to people. And we can got automation to do that. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, I think, you know, what's interesting to me is when we start talking about how we deliver a strong candidate experience and a better front end to that, the entire recruiting process, what we usually talk about is accountability and research that's done that falls to the recruiter. And, you know, in the first few years where this is taking off and people are launching surveys, we're doing these hiring manager satisfaction surveys. And we're holding these recruiters accountable to candidate flow, and we're holding them to quality of candidates that come through. And now we're even holding them accountable to the experience that, in part, the candidates have. And what I think a lot of organizations miss is a recruiter satisfaction or another level or extension of that, where we begin to hold hiring managers accountable to the satisfaction. And I think that's a big one, because you get a lot of the hiring managers that They just they know what they're going to want, but they know it when they see it. That kind of mentality, or the interview is over in 30 seconds. I just knew this wasn't the right person, and it becomes sort of just an assembly line piece. And I think if there's a level of accountability that some companies are extending, it really does help, I think, from a research standpoint and a follow-up delivery as to really what we should be amending or what we should be focusing on too. There's two sides to that, I think.
I think you're right, Chris, and in fact, it ties in. One of our viewers, Graham, is I think aligning himself to that. He says HR and recruiters need to have a symbiotic relationship to impact the chance of getting the right hire. In a tight talent market, it's a marketing role, not just hiring manager, HR, or recruiters. And he also says that we as recruiters can often be guilty of seeing people as applicants, not as career customers. And I think that's an interesting combination of that. If candidate is consumer, consumer is candidate, isn't it? They are career customers, and we don't treat them that way.
Very true.
Yep, sorry.
I think it's actually very, very true. I think I'm in quite a fortunate position that we don't have huge volumes of applicants or candidates or career customers to deal with. So we are able to spend a little bit more time talking to people and personalizing those communications. But I know from previous roles in previous organizations that didn't feel like it was a possibility that you could put a personal spin on each one of those conversations or communications. So yeah, but I think that's a really valid point.
Thanks, Lee.
Going back to the previous comment, though, I'm just thinking about what we're also quite fortunate about in our current position here. We've got a lot of excitement about various initiatives that are going on in the business, and we're talking about champions. We're in a position where we're rolling out our kind of cultural change piece, and we've got some values and behaviours, and it's got a lot of excitement in the business around our factories as well as our corporate office. So that is actually helping us to get a bit of traction with our recruiting managers to allow them to talk passionately about those values and what makes it such a great place to work. So we're really, really fortunate. But I guess that might be a vehicle that other organisations might look to use if they don't have something similar in operation at the moment.
Thanks, Lee. Gerry, one of the questions I might ask when you're doing that candidate experience stuff and you're surveying those candidates, is anybody asking them, hey, Mr. Candidate, Ms. Candidate, do you want to be in my talent pool? Because, I think to me, as much as I've spent a lot of time like Charu building ATSs, building candidate databases, building talent pools, talent puddles, but at the same time, it seems that we're never really asking that question, like, do you want to be in my pool, and why would you want to be in my pool?
Yeah, I think that we have a lot of work to do to build better pipelines is really the answer to that question. And where you might start is with the candidates that you have now that have gotten there in whatever way that they did, because they are the ones, since 99% of them you're going to reject for one reason or another. The point is, do some of them have the potential for developing the skills, knowledge, and experience to come back and participate and learn about the company, about what they might need in order to compete more effectively for a job down the stream. So if we're treating all of the candidates, including those that we reject, well, you're going to increase the number of folks who want to be in that pool long term or contribute to the pool because of their ability to identify other people that should be considering you. So it is really starting with how we treat them now that impacts that pool downstream. And we're, depending on the industry and the type of company, I would be asking the question, have you ever applied here before? I would be trying to better understand if these are customers. We know that in some industries, retail particularly, something like 50 to 75% of all the candidates are in fact customers as well. And we know that a lot of people who are out there have in the past applied, had a great experience, and are returning now having learned what it takes to compete more effectively for the job. So if we keep encouraging those kinds of things, I think we automatically start building the pool.
So, can I just chip in here with an example? I know I mentioned this to Lee when I spoke to him the other day. We had a client that was based in London, large retail store, very high end, and she said to me when we were recruiting for them, the biggest problem we're going to have here, Mark, is that 90% of the people that apply are customers. They love this store, they just want to spend more time in the store. So how are we going to deal with these people that we're going to decline, because we're only looking to recruit half a dozen people? So we came up with an idea to send out a thank you letter to all the people we declined and offered them a 20% discount on any experience they had when they came into the store, as long as they spent a minimum of £100. And out of 676 applications, they had over 125 people use this offer to come back into the store with. And we did this. We repeated this with a restaurant where the guy was recruiting chefs, and he was worried that the advertising campaign worked too well. It had attracted all the good chefs in the area, and he didn't want to upset them in case he needed more. And we invited them to come and have a 50% discount in the restaurant at any time. And he got more than 50% of the people come in and actually use that offer as well. So you can take an applicant and turn them into a customer.
Absolutely.
Good experience.
Lewis, that's great. I think that's a fabulous example of how people are closing those that they don't hire in a way that engages them for the future.
You're right, and thanks, Mark, for that. It's a good experience, and I really appreciate what everybody's done. That's okay, Gerry. We've only got a couple minutes left. You know, we could do this, I think, for another 2 or 3 hours for sure. But we are getting near the end of the allotted hour, and Gerry's power may fail at any time. Guys, I'd like each of you just one final point, if you don't mind. And I guess we're back to the original theme that we can work on the candidate experience. What's your one tip to improve the candidate experience and its impact on your company's brand, not just your employment brand? Chris?
Yeah, I think I really do think it boils down to treating others as you would want to be treated. I mean, God forbid any of us are struggling to find employment or on a job search ourselves. I think it really is about putting ourselves in their shoes and walking even just a half a mile to try to figure out where some of those hot points are that we can address. And I think the big part of getting that done is looking for that low-hanging fruit, and I think finding some champions that can sort of help you really move that needle and making those and really making data-based and data-driven decisions along the way. And that's it's easy for us on this call to sort of spit that out. That's having done that, and several people on the call have done it. I'm sure dozens in the stream. That is a big challenge, and it's a tough piece to push. Hats off to anybody who just continues tirelessly to make that difference.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. Good points there. Charu, what about you?
Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. So I agree wholeheartedly with Chris, but my sort of point would be to, before we can fix anything, we need to kind of work out what the problem statement is. And we know that candidate experience needs to be improved, but I would start with break down at every little step of the candidate journey. So from the line manager intake session to them being onboarded, break that down and then sort of work out what can be improved, even if it's 10%, what can be improved. So analyze your candidate recruiting process, and also look at things like NPS or Candy sort of research, because that gives you great benchmark for those stakeholder conversations and those sponsor conversations that we're talking about.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charu. Lee, how about for you?
I think I would keep it simple. I would say be honest and be timely. In the most recent experience that I've had here, candidates really appreciate an honest update, even if it's not great news. And that's served us really well so far.
Brilliant. Gerry, final word from you, and including that, how do people in UK EMEA find out about these Candies Awards and participate?
The first thing, the last one is the Candies THECANDES.org. So there's that. My tip is to take this video for the hour and rewatch it and take some notes. I will tell you that all of the 5 pieces of data that Mark pointed out are really common sense. Were talked about at one point or another. We talked about setting expectations. We talked about demonstrating that you can listen to your candidates. We talked about closure. We talked about accountability on the part of not just the recruiters, but really the employers and the hiring managers. And we talked about influencing the perception that it's a fair process. And if you figure out creative ways that align to your brand to do those 5 things, any one of those 5 things, you will change the candidate experience. And if you measure it by NPS, you'll see that change and be encouraged to do more.
Brilliant, Gerry, and there's a great wrap up. And I think Louise, hopefully she took notes because she does an end of show blog, and you've just written the wrap up paragraph for us, so I appreciate that. My thanks to all of our guests and everybody in the webinar jam. Too many names there to count, but Charu, Gerry, Chris, Lee, thank you for that. And of course our usual team. Louis, I'm going to kick it over to you for the final close. And you're right. Everybody, rewatch the show, post it on your sites, spread the word for great experience. Louis.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you all. Fantastic show, and thanks to everyone who's contributed. Lots of conversation and webinar jam. They just sort of do their own thing, as Alan's saying. So, and thanks Johnny, Catherine, Graham, Rahul, and everyone else on there. The next show, 6th of July, I think. We'll confirm everything in the next couple of weeks, including our guests. We're going to be talking about using the data in your business or in your recruitment agency to help you find the right candidates or the best candidates. So there's a lot of conversations at the moment going on about data trends, semantics, and et cetera, and seeing how that will work for you. So keep a lookout on the RecHangout blog. We'll be sending out the RecHangout blog for this episode from Louise to everyone who signed up after the show in the next couple of days. That's all from me. So thank you, everyone. Take care. See you next time.
Thanks, Louis. And